So hello and welcome everyone. We are really happy that you could join us today to this session where our presenter will tell you more about some UI and API tricks with the title of Trading the UI for the API. But before we going into that, let's just quickly do some housekeeping. The webinar itself is recorded and it will be available on our site. You all who joined will receive an email when that's uploaded, and you will also receive the Q&A sheet with all the questions answered. Those which were answered live in the webinar will be timestamped to the YouTube video where you can check the answers. And those which will not be answered here live today, there will be a written answer for that. The Q&A section will be at the end of the webinar. For that, please make sure that you use the Q&A pane of Zoom. We will have 10-15 minutes to answer all the questions. So everything will be there. Just please make sure that you use the Q&A section of Zoom. So our presenter today is the CTO of Yamagata, Jourik Ciesielski. So Jourik, we are very happy to have you here. Please let me pass the mic to you.
Thank you very much, Benz. I start sharing screens. Benz, you can stop sharing screen now and I can take over. So while I do so, I quickly want to say thank you to the memoQ team for having me, for giving me the floor today. I find it really great that a company like memoQ gives people like me, non-memoQ staff, not just the floor, but also the opportunity to basically run the show. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. Thank you for introducing me as well, Ben. So I'll quickly introduce myself as well. So as mentioned, I'm the CTO for Yamagata Europe. We are an LSP based in Belgium, in Ghent. I'm also the co-founder and the owner of my own company, CJ International, and under the umbrella of my own company, I do consulting, localization engineering, market research, and technology training. Let me start the presentation, and then we are ready to rock and roll. So about today's session, the session will be all about trading the user interface of your favorite TMS for its API. We delivered this presentation earlier this year at memoQfest, and the evaluation was very good. So we decided to recycle the materials and present them today again in a webinar. So that's the background of today's webinar. The topic is very interesting. I think APIs are one of the most crucial assets in technology, so I'm pretty much looking forward to delivering this presentation to you. What are the prerequisites for you to follow this webinar and take away something from it? First of all, you are not supposed to have coding experience. You are not supposed to be a very experienced developer. So if you expect me to build a triangle connection between memoQ and a business management system on the one hand and a proprietary CMS on the other hand, then I apologize, because that's not going to happen in this webinar. But you are supposed to be tech savvy, interested in technology. You should know the fundamentals of APIs. You really need to know what an API is. You need to know your way around JSON, know a thing or two about regular expressions, and of course, XML. Everything that we will be talking about today is based on XML. So a little bit of knowledge of XML is going to be crucial for today's webinar. The session will be mainly hands-on, so I will be doing a couple of demos in Postman on the one hand and Python on the other hand. Why Python? First of all, because Python is very academic, which is very suitable for a webinar like today's webinar. Second, Python is the only programming language that I know. I know for a fact that the memoQ APIs communicate better with C#, but I would make a total fool out of myself if I tried to use C# in today's webinar. So safe bet, let's go for Python today. What are the topics? What are we going to do today? First of all, I'm going to present the memoQ APIs to you because memoQ has quite a lot to offer when it comes to APIs. And we're also going to talk about the differences between SOAP APIs and REST APIs. There are fundamental differences between the two types of APIs, and those differences need to be very well understood. By the way, SOAP APIs are commonly known as web services, and the official name of the memoQ API is also the memoQ Web Services API. So I will apply the correct terminology from now on, and I will refer to the memoQ API as the Web Services API. We're going to talk about the different building blocks that are needed to construct API calls using the memoQ Web Services API. And maybe more importantly, I will tell you where you have to retrieve the required pieces of information from. That's also very important. And now we're going to get a little bit of work done. We're going to list the users on a memoQ server using the Web Services API, and we're going to use Postman for that demo. I'm going to explain how to list the light resources on a memoQ server, specifically project templates, also using the Web Services API, also using Postman. And we're going to wrap up today's webinar by writing a very simple Python application that creates a memoQ project based on a project template. So that is the agenda for today's webinar. What are the materials that we need for today's webinar? What are we going to work with? First of all, we need the API documentation, which can be consulted online and contains a lot of necessary data points for us to get work done. We also need the API specifications, which consist on the one hand of WSDL files and XSD files. WSDL and XSD files are available for the different web services that will be consumed. The memoQ API contains or supports a lot of web services, and today we will be working with 3 web services: the resource web service, the security web service, and the server project web service. And we will show and work with the specifications, the WSDL and the XSD files. I have prepared 3 XML files as well. And those XML files contain the data, the XML data that we're going to process in our API calls, that we're going to send to the server. I will be using them to speed up the process a little bit, so I might use them in the demos. And last, I have prepared a little Python library that does a couple of interesting stuff. And we will be using this Python library again to speed up the process when we create our own Python application to create a project based on a template. So these are the materials that you will be seeing during the demos. Okay, in terms of APIs, memoQ Server offers 3 APIs. There's one SOAP API, the Web Services API, there's one REST API, and there's one CMS API. The Web Services API is by far the most comprehensive API, covers a wide range of functions. The REST API is a little bit more limited. It mainly offers functionalities related to translation memory and term-based operations. Looking up segments in translation memories, for example, that's something that you can easily do using the REST API. The CMS API is not taken into consideration today. It's totally out of scope. But the CMS API is the API that you will be using if you want to build that notorious triangle connection between memoQ and the BMS and the CMS. That's where the CMS API comes into play. And something else, apart from the APIs, memoQ also has a couple of SDKs, and I think they're pretty much worth mentioning in today's webinar as well. memoQ has, for example, a preview SDK, which allows you to build a custom in-context preview for one of your file formats. There's a machine translation SDK, which allows you to build your own machine translation plugin. There's a TM SDK, a TB SDK, which allows you to extend the capabilities for translation memories and term bases. So memoQ is pretty scalable, and you can really tailor it in accordance with your own needs and your own wishes, using the APIs on the one hand, but also using the SDKs on the other hand. A quick table highlighting the most important differences between REST APIs and SOAP APIs. I think that the REST APIs are the standard. I think they are more commonly accepted and used and deployed compared to SOAP APIs for a couple of obvious reasons. REST APIs mainly use JSON for data representation. So you send your data in JSON to the server and you receive your response also in JSON from the server. Mainly JSON, but not exclusively JSON. So you can also exchange data between servers using REST APIs in HTML, in XML, even in plain text. So it's not limited to JSON, but mainly JSON. REST APIs are really, really flexible. So imagine you're writing a Word document and you're adding a hyperlink to a certain word. If someone clicks on that hyperlink, technically that is an API call. So very easy, very flexible, can be deployed in a lot of places. REST APIs are consumed by a wide range of clients, web applications, mobile applications, you name it. You can integrate REST APIs in there quite easily. And as a result, they are suited for applications that are not so heavy, lightweight, and especially scalable, right? REST APIs do not have a formal standard, so you're not forced to follow a certain standard, but there are a couple of architectural principles, a couple of best practices, and we refer to those best practices as the RESTful design, hence the name REST API, right? So those are the REST APIs. What are the most important differences with SOAP APIs? SOAP APIs exclusively use XML for data representation and data exchange, exclusively XML, no way to work with JSON. They are less flexible compared to REST APIs, and they have a higher overhead, which makes them a little bit more complex to implement in your workflows, in your processes. And they are very often used in enterprise level applications. I have worked with enterprises who only accept SOAP APIs in their processes, in their technology stack. So security, reliability is crucial in the case of SOAP API. So that is the most important thing to remember here. I believe also important, SOAP APIs have a formal specification, and this formal specification is the WSDL standard, and you need to follow the specification strictly if you want to embark on implementing SOAP APIs in your processes and in your technology stack. So big differences, both very powerful, both advantages, both weaknesses. It really depends on the situation, whether you want to opt for a SOAP API or a REST API. But again, REST APIs are considered to be the new standard, whereas SOAP APIs are older, but more robust, more solid. That's the main difference. In the case of the memoQ web service API, it's actually a container for multiple APIs, for multiple SOAP APIs, for multiple web services. And these different web services cover different memoQ server functions, and everything is, of course, pretty well documented. So I invite you to have a look at what the memoQ API is capable of doing for you. Then we can continue with the different building blocks. We need 4 building blocks to construct memoQ web service API calls. And the first one is the server endpoint, or the URL, right? We're going to post data to a certain URL, and it's not like you can choose what URL you are using. The URL consists of 2 parts. First of all, it consists of the base address, and second, it consists of the actual server endpoint. The base address can be retrieved from the server administrator settings in your memoQ client, in your memoQ application, whereas the server endpoint can be consulted in the API documentation. I have added an example to the slide. It's the last bullet point. I will give you a second to have a look at it, and then I will show you where to retrieve the necessary information from. So first things first, I'm going to go to my memoQ. So I do have a memoQ server. It's a test server, so I can play around and do whatever I want to do on this server. I do have a couple of resources on this server. So if I open up my resource console, I have translation memories, I have term bases, I also have project templates. For example, have a quick look at this template, the raw MT template, because this is the template that we will be using in our application, our Python application that we will be using. I can also go to my server administrator settings, connect to my server, and I have an option here that says Web Services API Interface. If I open up this menu, you will see that the base address is specified for me here. This is the base address. And I also have my API key, right? If you communicate with the server through an API, you need to authenticate in some way to the server. And the most common way of authenticating is through an API key. This is where you can find your API key. Second, we need the actual server endpoint, and we can retrieve the server endpoint through the memoQ API documentation, right? So this is the API documentation, which can be consulted online. If I go to the concepts option over here, accessing the services, you will see that the URLs and the necessary endpoints are listed per web service that can be consumed, right? So again, in today's webinar, we will be using the Light Resource Management web service, we will be using the security web service, and we will be using the server projects web service. So let's maybe start with the security web service, right? Let's construct our URL. Let me quickly do this in my web browser. So I start using HTTPS, then I continue with my base address, and that is .memoQ.com 091/CJ Intel, and then I add my server endpoints to this. If I go to this page, to this URL, it will not work, and it's not supposed to work, so this is pretty much okay. But if I take away the last part of the URL, the security service part in this case, and I hit enter, it will work. So this pretty big XML file will open up for me. This is the WSDL specification for the security web service. So the entire specification can be consulted here. And the fact that I can access the specification means that my API is up and running, it's operational, and I can use it. So this is the server endpoint. This is the URL consisting of the base address and the actual endpoint. Let me go back to my presentation. So building block number 1 has been sorted out, the server endpoint. Building block number 2, the headers. If we make an API call, we need to add a couple of headers to our API call. 2 headers to be more precise. The first one is content type, and the value for the content type header never changes. It's always text XML charset equals UTF-8. So that's pretty easy. The second header that needs to be included in our API call is the SOAP action header, and the value of the SOAP action header specifies which action you'd like to carry out. If we want to obtain the values, the potential values, we need to consult the WSDL specification, and we can find the necessary actions in the WSDL operation elements. Again, I have added an example to this slide. I will give you a couple of seconds to have a quick look at the example on this slide. And then we will show, or I will show where you can find these actions, these values in the specifications. Okay, so I have downloaded the WSDL specifications locally. I'm going to open them up. I'm going to the appropriate web service, which is security in this case. I have my WSDL file over here. I'm going to open it in my notepad. I'm going to look for the WSDL operation elements. And you will see that in the case of listing users, this is what I'm going to do in the first place, listing users, that if I want to list the users on my memoQ server using an API call, that this is the required action to be included in the header, the SOAP action header, right? So this is where you can retrieve the action from. Wonderful. Then we can continue to the next building block that we need. The third building block is a XML namespace, right? So we are going to process XML data. We're going to send XML to a server, and we're going to retrieve XML from the server. And we're going to use custom elements specified in a custom XSD provided by memoQ, right? If we want our XML to be valid and well-formed and everything included, we need to specify that the custom elements coming from the custom XSD belong to a certain namespace. Where can we find the namespace to be included for those elements in our XML data? We can also find it in the WSDL specification, and we don't need to really look for it because it is listed in the root element of the WSDL specification, right? Let's have a quick look at our WSDL specification over here. If I go to the root element, WSDL definitions, we have a namespace declaration for TNS, which stands for target namespace. And this is the namespace that we need to use in our XML data for the custom elements coming from the custom XSDs provided by memoQ. That's the third building block. Then we're coming to the fourth building block. And this is the last building block. It's maybe the most important building block. It's at least a building block that requires a bit of work for you to put together. This is the SOAP XML message, or the SOAP XML body. This is the XML data that we're going to send to the server, and it needs to be correct if we want to receive a response from the server as well, right? You can have a quick look at this XML file. It's a fully fledged SOAP XML body. Everything is included, everything works, and I think we can break down this XML a little bit and talk about the different components. So on the first line, we have the traditional XML declaration, which needs to be included. Then we have the root element, which is envelope, and in the root element, we have a namespace declaration for the S namespace. Then we have a header element, and in the header element, I'm supposed to specify my API key. No API key means no API connection. And then I have a body element, and inside the body element, I'm supposed to use the elements from the custom XSD that are provided by memoQ, right? So in this case, I can use this SOAP XML body to execute an API call that lists all the user on my memoQ server. In order to do so, I need to add only one element to the body element, which is list users. It's not supposed to contain any additional data. The only thing that we need to do is make sure that we declare the namespace for this custom element, the list users element. So this is the XML body that we're going to include in our API call. So the different building blocks that we have been discussing on the slides, they correspond to the API call to list all the users on the memoQ server. We're now going to retrieve the different pieces of information and put them together in a fully fledged API call and hopefully receive a response from the server. These are the demos that we're going to do. As just mentioned, we're going to list the users on the server in Postman. Then we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to list the available project templates also in Postman. And then we're going to write our Python script to create a project based on the template. That being said, I'm out of slides and we can move to Postman. This is Postman. If you play around with APIs yourself, if you work with APIs yourself, you will know, use, and love Postman as well. Postman is a great tool to test APIs and to develop APIs. It's free. It's also very well documented. So if you're interested in working with APIs, please have a look at Postman because it will make your life a lot easier. Okay, let's create a new API call. There we go. The first thing that we need to insert, that we need to introduce is our server endpoint, again, consisting of the base address and the appropriate endpoint. There we go. In my case, we have our base address. And to the endpoint, we still have to add the security service. Otherwise, we're working with the metadata URL, which is not what we're looking for, right? So this is the complete URL. This is the complete endpoint. Then we can continue with the headers. Remember that we need to add 2 headers. The first one is content type. And the value is always the same, text XML, car set equals UTF-8. And we also need to define our SOAP action header. Remember that in order to retrieve the appropriate action, we have to have a look at our WSDL specification. We have to look for the values in the WSDL operation elements, and we want to apply the list users method, and this is the corresponding action that we need to use as the input, right? Here it is. So let me copy and paste the action over here. So far, so good. The only thing that we still need to do is create our body. In order to have our XML body, I set this option to raw and then to XML. This is not limited to XML, but in our case, we need to work with XML. And I have prepared the entire XML file already, listusers.xml. So this is identical to the XML body that we have been discussing on the slides. You will see the envelope root element, its namespace declaration, the header, and the API key, and then the body that holds one element, the list users element. It doesn't contain any additional data, no values, no child elements. It only contains the namespace declaration, which is really crucial in this case. Otherwise, it will not work. So let me quickly copy paste this entire XML file and paste it in this field over here. And if everything goes well, I can now hit the send button, send all the data to the server, and hopefully we receive a response, which seems to have worked out pretty well. So this is the response. This is a pretty big XML file, which contains user information for all the users on my memoQ server. So in this case, I have user info for someone called MT Reviewer 1 AR, which stands for Arabic in this case. We can see that the username for this user is identical, MT Reviewer 1 AR. And more importantly, every user, every resource, every asset on the memoQ server has a GUID, an ID. In this case, we have this GUID for this specific user. And the GUID is very, very important. If we want to create a project based on a template in our code in Python, we need to work with a specific user GUID. So we need to extract this value in some way when we write our own application. So GUIDs are crucial, very important. You need them to execute a lot of operations when using the API, right? So far, so good. We have seen the different building blocks. We know where to retrieve the different pieces of information from. I propose to do another API call in Python, the second one, to list the different project templates. Let's repeat the procedure. Let's look for the building blocks. Let's add them here. Let's execute the API call, and let's see what the result is. After that, we can continue with the Python application. So first things first, we need our endpoint. So I'm gonna go to my API documentation again. This time I'm going to work with the Light Resource Management web service, and the appropriate endpoint for this web service is memoQ services /resource/resource service. Let me copy paste and get this into Postman. Endpoint check, URL check. So that's our first building block. Then we continue with our headers. The content type header is not supposed to change. This one is okay. The SOAP action header is supposed to change. So let's look for the appropriate value here. In order to do so, I'm going to go to my WSDL specification. I'm going to go to the appropriate web service, which is resource. I'm going to open up the WSDL file. I'm going to look for the WSDL operation elements, and the method that I want to apply this time is the list resources method. And if I want to apply this method, the action that I have to use as the input is this one. There we go. So let me copy paste this as the new value for the SOAP action header. Let's move on with our body, right? Our body needs to change as well. So let me get rid of what we need to do now. And let me quickly show you where you can get the appropriate XML elements from. So we have to use certain elements. We have to add them to our SOAP XML body. Where does this data come from? And how do we know which elements to use, right? In order to do so, we don't need to work with the WSDL file, but we do need to work with the XSD file, which is the XML specification, right? So let me quickly open it up in my notepad. Let me quickly look for the list resources method. There we go. I have found it. I don't know if you know how to read XSD files, but if you know how to read XSD files, you will know that if we want to use the list resources method in our API call, we need to add an element with the name list resources. But unlike the API call to list the users on the memoQ server, we have to add a little something extra to it, right? In the case of list resources, we only had to add one element, no additional data, no child elements. In this case, we do have to add one element, which is the resource type element. Here it is. And we do have to add the resource type element as a child element of the list resources element, right? So this is how to read an XSD file. How do we know which potential values we can add to the resource type element? They are listed as well in the XSD file. Here they are. And in this case, we are interested in the project template resource type. So this is how to read the XSD file. You can find this information also in the API documentation, but in the API documentation, it is really based on C#. So it doesn't make really sense if you want to use it for Python or other programming language. So there we go. I have already constructed the entire SOAP XML body, which is listresources.xml. This will sound and look familiar already. We have the envelope root element, the header, the API key, the body. In the first element of the body, the list resources element, we have our namespace declaration, and then we have our resource type child element, which specifies the project templates as the resource that we want to list using our API call. So let me quickly copy paste this XML file, dump it in here, and if everything goes well, I can execute my API call and hopefully receive a response from the server, which is the case this time as well. Again, I receive a pretty big XML file from the server. It lists all the project templates that I have on my memoQ server. Let's look for the most interesting one. This is it, raw empty. This is the template that we are interested in. This is the template that we are going to use in our Python application. and mind the GUID. So project templates also have GUIDs. Again, every resource on the memoQ server has a GUID, and in the API, you need to work with GUIDs, not with names of resources. You need to work with the GUIDs of the resources. That's how it works. So if you write our application, we need to extract this GUID in some way, and then we can apply it, and then we can use it. That's how it works. Okay, so far so good. So we have talked about the different building blocks. We know where to retrieve the different pieces of information from. Certain pieces are a little bit cumbersome because you have to read XML or you have to dive into the API documentation, but this is how it works. We know how to construct the SOAP XML body. We have put together 2 API calls. Number 1, list users. Number 2, list light resources. And everything is working out pretty well. Of course, we're working in Postman. Postman is nothing but a tool to test APIs. This is not something that you can deploy in your processes. So let's take this to the next level and let's write a little application that does a little bit more, that combines different API calls in one logic, in one script, and then does something. So that's the next step. That's what we're going to do now. So I'm going to leave Postman behind. And now we're going to work in Python, right? So we're going to write a script that creates a project from a template. What do we need in order to put that script together? First of all, you need to have Python installed on your computer. It's free. You can go to python.org/downloads and then install Python on your machine. You can use it from that moment on. You need to have a good, solid Python editor. You can basically write Python scripts in Notepad++ if you like, and then run that script from the command line. But that's pretty cumbersome. That's pretty error prone. So my weapon of choice is PyCharm, which is what you're seeing right now. It's free and it works pretty well. So I'm pretty satisfied with PyCharm as my Python editor. What else do we need? I have already put together a Python library, memoQ.py. And this Python library does everything that we have been doing in Postman so far. So first of all, it lists all the users on the memoQ server, then it selects one specific user and it extracts the GUID of that specific user. It does the exact same thing with project templates. It lists all the templates on a server, it selects one specific template and then extracts the GUID of that specific template. It remembers those GUIDs so we can apply them in our script to create a project from a template. And that's what we're going to do now. We basically need to write like 6 or 7 lines of code, so it's not a lot of work, and we can create projects using that script. So let's do that. In my memoQ folder, I'm going to create a new file, a new Python file. I'm going to call this Python file create project from template. And we start with a blank page and we can start writing code, right? The first thing that I need to do is import my memoQ library. There we go. Crucial, otherwise it will not work. The library will extract the user and the template, remember the GUID, and give it to us in this script. Second, I'm going to import another library, which is the requests library. And this is actually a big mistake because the request library is actually designed for REST API requests and not for SOAP API requests. Python comes with dedicated libraries for SOAP APIs, SUTs and ZEEP and many others. But I'm still going to use the requests library because it allows me to work with the different building blocks that I have been discussing in this webinar so far. So I can just take those building blocks as such and use them in my script. So that's the logic, that's the philosophy behind the requests library in this case. And then I can start writing my code. First of all, first building block, we need our endpoint. So I'm going to create an object for my endpoint equals, and then the only thing I need to do is look for the necessary URL, the necessary endpoints, and add it to my script. So I'm quickly gonna go back to Postman and copy paste my base address. There we go. And then I'm going to have a quick look at the API documentation, look for the server projects, web service, and copy paste the endpoint from here. Copy, paste. There we go. Endpoint, check. Then I'm going to create an object for the project name. We need to define the name of the project that we're going to create in some way. And I'm going to create, or I'm going to convert this object into an input object, which means that the user of the script will be asked to provide the name of the project in plain text, right? For example, please specify the name of the project. Endpoint check, project name check. Then we can continue with our headers. So let's create an object for the headers. And we need to add the headers in a Python dictionary. A Python dictionary is basically a little JSON file where you hold or store the data in key value pairs. Like this. The first header, content type. And I need to put my header between quotes. There we go. And we know the value of the content type header, text, XML, charset equals UTF 8. Then we're going to create our second header, which is SOAP action. And again, in order to retrieve the correct action, we need to have a quick look at our WSDL specifications. In this case, I'm interested in the server project, web service. I'm going to open up the WSDL specification. I'm going to look for the different operations that are supported in this web service. And this time, I'm interested in this method, create project from template, which requires me to use this action as the input. Copy and paste that into my code. The last building block, the SOAP XML message, the SOAP XML body. I'm going to create a new object for it, payload. There we go. I have already prepared the entire XML file because it's a little bit bigger than the other ones. This is it. Create project template from XML. You will see that in the body element, we do have a couple of elements now. Create project from template. Don't forget about the namespace declaration, the create info child, and then we have a couple of XML fields, metadata fields to fill in, and they will sound pretty familiar if you create projects using the UI as well. The client needs to be filled in, the creator, user, description, domain name, project, and some more stuff that you can fill in here, metadata fields to be filled in. You will notice that I am using variables in this XML file, in this XML message, memoQ extract GUIDs and project name, and these variables will be resolved by the memoQ Python library that we are using in our script. So they will be turned into actual values. Let me quickly do something. We do have one little obstacle with this XML file. Python will not accept the line breaks in my XML file. So I am quickly going to escape them using \r and \n, which is the standard for Windows. That's the result that I was looking for. Copy paste. There we go. And paste it into my script. I also need to convert my payload object in an F string if I want the variables to be resolved by my library. Okay, so far so good. Then I'm going to create an object for the response that I hopefully will receive from the memoQ server. This is where I'm going to execute the actual API call, right? And in order to do so, I'm going to call the requests library. I'm going to execute a request. The method in this case is post. This is not crucial. I'm going to use the endpoint from my endpoint object. I'm going to use the headers from my headers dictionary. And I'm going to use the data from my payload object. And this is it. This should be more than enough to create a project on our memoQ server using a template. So the last thing that we can do is, for example, print a message on our screen if everything goes well. For example, success, the project, and then we're going to use our project name variable has been created on the memoQ server. There we go. And this should be more than enough. Let's have a quick look. Let's see whether everything works as expected. I'm going to run my create project from template script. First of all, the script is asking me to specify the name of the project. Let's call it test from API. Enter. Then the memoQ library asks me to specify the memoQ username, the user that's going to create the project on the memoQ server. In my case, it's the admin user. Enter. Then the memoQ library asks me to specify the name of the project template that I want to use to create my project. Remember the name, raw empty. And if I now hit enter, the project should be created on my memoQ server. Success, the project has been created on the server. Let's have a quick look to ensure that this is true. If I refresh everything, you will see that I have a new project on my memoQ server, test from API. And all the settings from the project template should have been taken over. I have my different languages. I have the settings. I have the metadata fields filled in. So this is how it works. This is how you can create your own quick application to create projects on a template, based on a template. And this can be a good starting point for you to create your own applications, to do stuff, to create connections, to import things. You could take this to the next level. You could create something that imports files into your projects as well. However, I must mention that importing files using the API is a little bit difficult. You have to break down the files, you have to read the bytes. So you do have to have more experience than me to make that happen. But you can very easily convert the application that we've just written and put some user interface elements on top of it, for example. I do have an example here. This is another script. This is basically the exact same script as the one that we've written together, the one that we use to create projects from templates, but I have imported the Streamlit library here as well. And the Streamlit library allows me to create user interface elements and then open those user interface elements in a web browser, in Edge, in Chrome, in Safari, wherever you would like to open it. So we can have a quick look at how that would work. I'm going to open up my command line interface. I'm going to launch this script from the command line. If everything goes well, it will open in my web browser, in Edge in my case. It looks horrible, it looks very ugly, but it does what I want it to do. This application uses the memoQ web service API to create projects from templates. It asks me to fill in the exact same data. Please specify your memoQ username, which is admin in my case. Please specify the name of the project. Let's call it test with UI. Please specify the name of the template you want to use. I still want to use the raw MT template. And if I now hit enter, it should say that the test with UI project has been created on my memoQ server. Quick confirmation, if I refresh, you will see that the test with UI project has been created as well. So that's basically the message that I wanted to convey. This is how it works. A basic application on the API is not too difficult. You can create user interfaces. You can take it to the next level, create connections, business management systems, and do all kinds of interesting stuff. But now you have seen the basics of the memoQ Web Services API, the different building blocks, where to retrieve the necessary pieces of information from, and then put everything together in an API call. That being said, I'm all done presenting. I think we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jourik. It was a really, really great presentation and with a lot of information. We have some questions, so let me fire those to you. The first one is there some way to use the APIs to use the in-country reviewers function?
Well, this is actually a question, I believe, for the memoQ engineers, because the in-country reviewers functionality is like brand new, and I haven't looked into it yet. So it wouldn't surprise me that there's not yet an API method, API functionalities available for the in-country reviewers functionality. But I think it would be good to present this specific question to the memoQ engineers and have it figured out with them.
We will do just that. Thank you for that. The second one is, after you finish showing how to fill out the body for the resource services demo, can you go back briefly to the headers section so I can grab a screenshot?
Okay. The resource service, that's where we list the different resources, in our case, the project templates. And I think, if I understood the question well, that this is the part that I had to show. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's exactly what we needed. So I will read you the next question, and hopefully that will be enough time to do a screenshot from this one. So, do the API calls behave differently with ELM versus CAL licenses?
I don't think so. I don't think there's a difference in functionality when using ELM licenses versus CAL licenses. So the answer is no. There should be no difference in functionality between the different licensing types. No.
Okay, thank you. And right now we have only one question, which is that will you be so kind to share the file that you just created, these sample files, so the audience can use it as a starting point for their journey into this field?
Yeah, of course, I think we can make it happen. I can definitely bundle everything in one pack, and then I think we can deliver it to the persons who have been attending the webinar today. So that should not be a problem.
Thank you very much for that. And we don't have any other questions, so let me just quickly wrap it up. Thank you very much for joining to us. As we said on the beginning of the presentation, the recording will be available on our website. You will receive an email when that's uploaded. You will receive the Q&A sheet and also the sample files from Jourik. So Jourik, thank you very much again for this great presentation. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.